Hello and welcome to this special edition of Free Voices. I'm Daniel Wild, Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, and it's wonderful to be here in the Ballyou Maya studio at the Institute of Public Affairs office in Melbourne. And it's also wonderful to be joined by Dr Anthony Dillon, Postdoctoral Fellow at the Australian Catholic University at the Institute of Positive Psychology and Education. As many of you know, Anthony is one of Australia's leading public intellectuals on matters relating to Indigenous affairs and Australian culture. In addition to his current role at Australian Catholic University, Anthony has served in a number of key government roles, including as a consultant for former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who is also a Distinguished Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, in his role as a Special Envoy to Indigenous Australians. Anthony has also served as a consultant with the Indigenous Evaluation Committee and with the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet from 2018 to 2020. Anthony, it's great to have you with us, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today. We'll be talking about the voice to Parliament, about challenges with Indigenous Australians and remote living. But to begin with, one of the questions I get a lot from our members about you is they're really interested in who you are and your background and how you came to be the public figure you are today. So I thought maybe we could start by you sharing with us your background and how you got to where you are.
Okay, look, first of all, thanks. It's an honour to be here, it really is. And thanks for those kind words. I actually had more written down for you to say, but that's fine. Look, when I look at my journey, I was, had an Indigenous parent, non-Indigenous parents. I was just kind of just raised in a normal home, had great input from both the Indigenous and non-Indigenous families. But in my early 20s, I started, and this was kind of pre-internet days, I was working for a public service in Queensland. And I eventually was asked to do stuff relating to data on Indigenous issues. And so I got interested in that.
Yep.
And I discovered very quickly that there seemed to be this message there that anything Indigenous should only be handled by Indigenous people, which was one of the reasons they got my input on things. And, every policy I picked up, Indigenous people are the best ones to do this. These services should only be handled by Indigenous people. And this was before, I think, the term identity politics had been invented. Before, I hadn't heard of it anyway. And that didn't sit right with me, that this whole separate, because my Aboriginal father had never taught me that way, and for goodness sake, he married a non-Indigenous woman. And so I didn't like this whole idea of Indigenous people are the best ones to look after Indigenous people. And so that's where it started, and that's where I kind of started to resist what was happening. And then the internet come onto the scene.
Yep.
And you could start researching and looking for things. I found more of the thing I opposed. I was able to send letters to the editor of the Courier Mail and eventually, find some like-minded people who thought the same way. So for me, how I got involved in this, I guess, was a reaction to what seemed not natural to me, that Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people are somehow separate, fundamentally different, and therefore Indigenous people only Indigenous people should look after Indigenous people. And, and that gave rise to what I call, or I use the term separatism.
Yes.
Which is not a good thing. And look, I think it's the most common sense argument I have. The commonalities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people far outweigh the differences.
Yeah.
And that's always been my starting point and my ending point.
That's such a key point that you make, that the commonalities are more significant and notable than the differences.
Yeah.
I've always thought that the basic building blocks of a dignified life, they don't depend on your race or your gender or your ethnicity. It's school, safe communities, jobs, access to infrastructure. These
belonging to the pack.
Yes.
Making contributions to the pack, and just mixing, whether they be black or white.
Why do you think that this has happened? So you referred to separatism.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of ideas or thoughts as to why we've gone down this path as opposed to, say, more integration or being together?
Well, kind of on a day-to-day level out there on the street, I think most Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are integrated. It's the
Yeah.
gatekeepers who are doing things differently.
Right.
Of course, things are a little bit different in remote communities, which we'll come to
Yes.
shortly. But why is it happening? Look, I personally think it's the gatekeepers are trying to portray Indigenous people as being separate. Even with remote communities, like I said, it's a special case and we need to discuss it. But even out there, you go sit with the people and within 5 seconds, they mostly they don't see colour. They just,
No.
and I've been with white colleagues out there as well.
Yeah.
And I'm considered white to a lot of them.
Right.
And many of them just don't care. They just see you as either a good guy or a bad guy, depending on your behaviour.
Yes.
If you behave like a jerk, they're going to see you as a jerk. But if you just be yourself, they'll embrace you. And yeah, so, we're still all one.
Yes.
But to answer the question, look, I really think the gatekeepers, people, some Indigenous leaders have been able to make nice little empires for themselves.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like the butcher who keeps his hand on the scales when he's weighing your meat.
Yes.
What's in it for him?
Yeah.
And these gatekeepers, it's not always money that they get, but just that status of, my people. I speak for my people.
Yeah.
And being able to emotionally blackmail someone else or shoot them down in an argument.
Yeah.
Because you haven't been oppressed the way I have for over 200 years. That sort of nonsense. That can be a bigger payoff than money. So let me be clear, I'm not...
Psychological benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying they're all chasing money. There are more powerful, intangible payoffs that keeps it going. And look, as one fellow I met over in Western Australia who lives in an area where there's a high proportion of Indigenous people, and he's well-meaning, good bloke, but he said, with regard to the people looking after Indigenous people, he summed it up so beautifully. If they did their job, they'd be out of a job.
Yes.
So that's pretty much it, as blunt as what it sounds.
Yeah.
And look, let me qualify that. That's not to say that there's not many good Indigenous people or even non-Indigenous people working in an Indigenous type capacity.
Yes.
They work their guts out. They pour their hearts into it. So
no, of course, no. That's I think very well put, and I think it leads into a discussion about the voice and this issue of separatism. And you've written quite extensively on the voice. You had a great column on Monday, 3rd of October, in the Daily Telegraph about the voice. And I just wanted to quote to you a couple of observations I thought were quite astute, and then get your response. And you say here, I quote, "Central to the Uluru Statement is the process of truth-telling. That's fine, so long as it includes truth about the major sources of harm to Aboriginal people," end quote. Can you explain what you meant by that, Anthony?
The harm done to Indigenous people, we all know what that is.
Yeah.
Right? And, more recently it's been brought into the spotlight because just Jacinta Price has been talking about it.
Yes.
Myself and others have been talking about it, and her mother. We should give credit to Bess.
Jacinta's mother?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So, when I first got into this, Bess was someone I met early on, and she was a lone voice, her and her husband.
Right.
Okay. But thankfully we got Jacinta today. That seems to be, her, for obvious reasons, she's talking about family.
Yeah.
Okay? So she's always talking about that. So we know the problems are, the violence, kids being neglected, not having safe places to, we hear this term, safe space. What about a safe place to sleep in?
Yes.
Just having nutritious food and that sort of, those things are missing.
Basics,
Often missing.
Yeah.
And I must say it was very disappointing. The other night I saw on Q&A, which I never watch, but I was because I don't have a TV.
Right.
But I was in a hotel room, and the topic of The Voice come up, and Alan Jones mentioned violence in Aboriginal communities, and the host just very quickly turned away from
This
it.
was Stan Grant was the host, was it?
Oh, was it? I can't remember his
I
name.
can't.
Was it?
Okay.
What was that his name?
It might have been Stan or one of the other hosts they have. Yeah.
This is only 2 nights ago.
Yeah.
Watching, so there's this silencing
Yeah.
of the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
So much easier to talk about the voice than to
Yeah.
talk about these hard things.
Would it be fair to say that one of your reservations about the voice is that it's just unlikely to address any of these issues, or that you don't need a voice to do that?
Correct, both. And that last point is very important because that's been another one of my main arguments. For the proponents of the voice, I haven't totally dismissed you yet, but you haven't won me over. I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. Can you please tell me what things this body or whatever will enable to happen that can't happen now?
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah.
I just can't think of what that might be. So I'm there, I've got open ears.
Yeah.
So please tell me. But at this stage, I think that it's not going to allow anything that we can't already be doing now. And the fact that we aren't doing things now, I think there's people on both sides of politics that need a bit of a whipping.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, there was something else you said, so I picked up on the last point.
Yeah, just that the voice won't do it. The voice is, depending, we don't know what it will be exactly, but in one shape or form, it's going to be essentially more politicians in Canberra supported by a bureaucracy, which is what we already have.
Yeah.
And I understand they've talked about having regional councils and so forth, but I'm somewhat cynical of the capacity of centralised government to deliver better outcomes to those particularly in regional communities.
Yeah.
So just putting aside the ethical or moral arguments, just a practical argument that I just don't see how on top of there's already a Indigenous Affairs component to the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet.
Yeah.
How would this be different to that?
Well, exactly. I asked that question just the other day on Twitter. We have a Minister for Indigenous Affairs.
Yes.
What's their purpose? So please tell us what it is that this voice, regardless of its manifestation, it's still a bit murky what that's going to be like. Tell us how that will help.
Yeah.
And the other concern I have is I think this is going to be seen like so many proposed or manifested silver bullets in the past, where people thought, oh yes, this will be it. And it just whether it be the apology or whatever, it just comes. And I'm not saying those things shouldn't happen, but I'm just saying, don't think this is going to be the game changer.
Yeah, it's a pretty important point, and we were talking just before we started recording about. I put it to you that I thought that a lot of the challenges that Indigenous Australians face is likely to be more attributable to their extreme remote living than it is anything to do with Australia being a racist nation. And that if you were to have anybody of any race, any background to live in extreme remote communities, you'll probably start to see them having challenges as well. Would you?
Absolutely, and we'll come back to the racism angle later too. Yes, there was Nicholas Rothwell wrote in The Australian several years ago, over a decade ago, and I think Tony Abbott featured in the article, who's always been a champion for Indigenous people. The headline was, "It's about place, not race," and I think that captures it pretty well.
Very nice.
Put it, a couple of hundred non-Indigenous people in a place where it's poorly resourced, poorly serviced, no jobs, that sort of thing, and very quickly you know what's going to happen, because people do, and traditional Aboriginal people knew this.
Yes.
You need purpose. You need to be making a contribution to those around you, i.e. work.
Yep.
And you need to be ongoing learners.
Yep.
So whether that be formal or informal learning, it just so happens that in the 21st century it's predominantly formal learning. It's pretty much a ticket you need to progress in society.
Yes.
So that's not to undervalue informal learning, but we live in an age where if you've got that school certificate, it opens a few more doors.
Yes.
And sometimes opening those few doors may mean relocating from the community, the area you were. And so, look, I think a better, if we just focus on the well-being, physical and emotional well-being of Indigenous people, we really need a Minister for Rural and Remote Development
Yes.
ahead of the Voice, in my opinion.
I think that's a really important point. And one of the things that we've argued in the past is basically you want to have economic opportunity, so removing the barriers to economic development that you can have in regional communities.
Yeah.
You want to have some element of decentralisation and local influence, and also legitimate property rights. As I understand it, I can buy or sell a house on my land, but if you're on Indigenous land, you can't necessarily do that in the same way, which means the capacity for private ownership and also for business development is somewhat truncated.
Yeah.
That's sort of been our perspective. Would you add to that in any way?
Yeah, no, Helen Hughes spoke about that for a long time.
Yes.
And with business development and that sort of thing, Warren Mundine's the sort of person you need.
Yeah, yeah.
That's where his heart is, sort of getting enterprise and people into businesses. And, there's a few of them out there, which is good, so we know it can be done.
Yes.
But, certainly the property ownership and that sort of thing. And, also, we won't spend too much time, in these places there are subsections of that population that are, have a lot of problems where, they're obviously not going to be functional for a little while, and they do need special attention.
Yes. Well, let's return to I mentioned racism and the accusation of racism, and that there is a segment of our community who will attribute any Indigenous disadvantage to racism, either overt racism on behalf of individual Australians or that broader critique of structural racism that
foggy term.
The foggy term. Well, they have two foggy terms. They've got structural racism, which is the superstructure, and then they've got the microaggressions, which is so they've got the two ends of the spectrum. And so obviously I don't subscribe to that argument. I'm assuming you don't, but what's your perspective?
I'm suffering from microaggression right now. I can't see any culturally appropriate. You should have read my mind and put some of those. I don't even know what they are myself, but like any society, there's elements of racism, but it's the true racism. But it's they're little pockets.
Yes.
And they certainly don't characterise a group.
Yeah.
And the analogy I use is, I don't think on Australian beaches we have a shark attack problem.
No.
That's despite having a couple of dozen shark attacks each year.
Yeah.
And some idiot might say to me, "Well, Anthony, you go tell that to the families of the shark attack victims." Well, if I did, I'm sure they would say it's not a problem generally.
Yep.
Their loved one was unfortunate. So yes, there are those pockets, but not enough to say we have a racism problem in Australia. Just like the shark attacks, can't say we have shark-infested waters. We have a shark attack problem on Australian beaches. No, there's shark attacks. Yes, there's instances of racism, but no, there's not a huge racism problem. And you definitely couldn't say Australia is a racist country.
Yep.
And again, just to qualify that, because I know what my enemies will say, Anthony said there's no such thing as racism in Australia. There is, but it's just not the big culprit. They make it out to be. That's affecting Aboriginal people. And for goodness sake, the goodwill of Australians, and this can be a strength and weakness, their goodwill to Indigenous people is enormous. They want good ththings to happen for them. And this is why we've got to be careful in how we deliver our message to them, because as great as what Aussies are, and as motivated as what they are to helping Indigenous people, I don't want to see them go down the path of thinking, well, a voice, give the Indigenous people a voice, that's a good way to help them. That's certainly coming from a good intention, but a lack of knowledge.
Yes.
The Indigenous people already have voices.
Yes.
Okay. And I just want to say one other thing about voices, the existing voices in Parliament. Here's an argument where I disagree with, some of my buddies on this, and many commentators out there. We keep hearing this message that, well, there's already 11 Indigenous voices in Parliament. No, they're Indigenous people that have voices on a range of topics.
That's right.
That are affecting all people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
Yeah.
So, I don't like that argument,
Yeah.
okay? And the non-Indigenous members of Parliament, they too are
Yeah.
there for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And again, referring back to Bess Price in the Northern Territory, when she was minister, she was minister for all people.
That's right.
And she made a point of, I'm not just there for the Aboriginal people. Obviously, she spent a lot of time with them because they make up a significant chunk of the population, and the problems they face are so severe. But she was a minister for the black and white,
Yes.
all people.
It's an important point because that's the whole basis of our system. We have representatives. So
Yeah, exactly.
That's the whole.
Yeah.
This is, and I agree with you. I'm actually a bit uncomfortable with having a minister for Indigenous Australians. It used to be a minister for Indigenous Affairs.
Yeah.
It changed to Indigenous Australians,
Sure.
and I'm a bit uncomfortable with the idea of having a minister who's there to represent one subset of our community. Sure. But it is a challenge, I think, to the broader idea that you have people of different backgrounds that still share common interests and concerns, and then they have, as one of their conduits to resolving that, their representative in Parliament. That's how our system of government actually works, and that's the whole idea of having a representative democracy. So I think you're right that the idea of saying these are voices only for one subset of our community is a real concern.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that simple. Those 11 Indigenous people are there to serve all, young and old, Indigenous and non-Indigenous.
I want to turn to just a slightly different topic. We talked about this briefly just before recording, which is a few years ago you were kind enough to do a video with us on The Voice, outlining what your views at the time were on The Voice, and we had a video featuring yourself, Jacinta Price and Senator James McGrath, and we put that out about 3 or 4 years ago originally, and that got a lot of interest and a lot of traction. And then the debate about The Voice kind of went to the background. So now that it's come back to the fore, we've re-released that video, put that out again, and it's got a lot of interest and a lot of traction. And as you know, we put that video on Facebook, as we do with all of our research videos. And we attempted to promote that video, as we do with all of our research videos.
Paying money for it.
Paying money to Facebook to promote our video to reach more people in the community. And Facebook banned us from doing that, which I find deeply concerning, and I know we're not the only organisation to have been banned or censored by social media. So I find that concerning. I'm interested, have you had any personal experience with censorship or cancel culture or these kind of issues that are becoming more prevalent?
Yeah, well, just certainly in some circles I move in, if there's another Indigenous person there and we're in disagreement, which we nearly always are when I move in academic circles.
Yep.
It's not to say that I don't like the person, but, we have very different views. I'm the one who has to shut up and not present my views, not contradict the other person. Yeah. So there's that sort of subtle self-censoring, I guess, where you just don't want to cause a scene. Because whereas, if they disagree with me strongly, I think, okay, that's fine. I'm not going to be upset about it.
Yeah.
But if I say something, they don't take it as well. So, I get that sort of silencing.
Yeah.
Which I don't like. And a lot of the time I just think it's just not worth it. I'll just shut up.
You're right. It's that kind of almost covert. It's not like someone's overtly cancelling you and threatening you with your career, but it's those little, you might call a little microaggression against you that you're not allowed to speak up in those environments. And I think the issue is, I don't know whether you call yourself conservative or what, but I use the term broadly conservative, those on the centre-right, that we do tend to self-censor a lot for fear of retribution or just because it's uncomfortable.
And look, sometimes it's the best thing to do, given the context, what we're in. And, I will tell people that sometimes, look, sometimes you're better off just shutting up because that's what I do. I just shut up. It's just not worth it. So you've got to ask yourself, the point you make, is this the right forum for it? Is this the right person to say it to? If not, just move on.
Yeah. Going back to your Daily Telegraph article, I wanted to put to you another quote, which really stood out to me, because we hear a lot about the gap, the Indigenous gap, which I think is a genuine source of concern. Not so much the gap, but the fact that Indigenous Australians struggle on so many elements. Yeah. And so, but you've made a good observation here, which I want to quote to you. We need to focus on another gap, not the gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. Specifically, we need to close the gap between well-off Aboriginal Australians and those Aboriginal Australians who we know live in despair, end quote.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure, because without getting too mathematical,
Yep.
if you have a group of people, one group here and another group here, let's suppose we're just looking at something as simple as income. Okay? This group have a lower income than this group over here. So there's variation within groups and between groups.
Yes.
Make sense?
Yep.
In this group, to lift up their average income, you can do that by making the richer ones richer, and you'll still lift the average, and you'll close that gap. But, common sense and a good heart tells us we really need to lift the income of the poorer people. So basically, if that's the variation in income in that group, we want to move that poorer end up.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does.
And so then you close the gap that way by closing the within gap.
Yes.
So you close the between gap by closing the within gap. And so we know that there are a lot of successful Indigenous people. And Warren Mundine made a good joke about that at CPAC, where he said someone accused him of being oppressed.
Yeah.
Warren said, I've got a couple of businesses.
Yeah.
I live in a nice home and I'm oppressed.
Yeah.
So, so we've got the ones who are doing well off, and they're typical. I think it's fair to say the architects of the voice fit into that category.
Yep.
And I'm kind of near that end of the spectrum rather than the poorer end of the spectrum, and I'd help out financially those in the poorer end. I'm sure to be shot down for saying that I help them financially. But, so if these ones can do it, these ones can do it with assistance, and it's not going to happen overnight. But we can see that, yes, it is possible to have successful, well-off Indigenous people. So we need to replicate the success so that we close the gap by bringing the poorer up to, and on all measures, health, et cetera, just that money's an easy one to talk about. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
And so there's this whole idea of closing the gap too is, I must say, in Sydney when I catch a train, there's an announcement there. I get deeply offended when the person says, "Mind the gap." It's just a reminder of this gap, and it's
intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, there's trauma about being told about the gap. So in sum, let's make sure that within the Indigenous camp, the poorer ones, well off, less well off, have exactly what their brothers and sisters have, which are, often not, but not always, the city cousins.
Yeah.
That's a broad generalisation. But
yes.
Viewers will know what we mean.
Yeah. There's just a couple of other questions I want to ask about your observations on the voice. And I think one point that you've made and others like Jacinta Price have made is that there isn't a voice, a single voice of Indigenous Australians. There's lots of diversity in Indigenous community, just as there's no non-Indigenous voice, there's no Chinese Australian voice, Indian Australian voice. What's your sort of take on the idea of a voice as opposed to there being individual Indigenous Australians who all have their own free will and autonomy?
Well, this is the point I've been talking about for more than 25 years.
Yeah.
And the voice just happens to be the latest platform where it's manifest. There's great diversity within Indigenous, the Indigenous camp, as there is for, as you said, for the non-Indigenous camp. So, and the frightening thing is typically when we hear about representation for Indigenous people, it's usually by people who hold views I don't agree with. So they will present this view. An ideal voice would be coming from the perspective of what I said earlier on when we started. The commonalities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people far outweigh the differences. Now, if this voice goes ahead and those people adopt that view, okay, I think this could have some potential. But I suspect it will be, no, we're very different. Mm-hmm. And so, if we come back to commonalities, there's commonalities and, there's also variation within the camp.
Yes.
And so to think that just Indigenous gives you this great common thread is a bit of a myth. So that's not to say that in different parts of Australia there can be locations where they're faced with a serious problem and that problem needs to be understood at the local level. You may even need someone who speaks the language to understand them. So you have those sorts of pockets. But generally speaking, to have an Indigenous voice, well, I mean, would you be comfortable if some leader, spokesperson, decided to decide for you, what was right and wrong because they had the same surname as you?
Yeah, not at all.
And for all the wilds, we're going to have a senior wild.
That would be a very interesting voice.
Yeah, because I'm sure even within your family, not just people who have the same surname as you, but within your family, there's going to be a lot of conflicts and disagreements and different problems and all that. Great diversity.
Yes,
and so it is with Indigenous people.
Yeah. One thing I was struck by in our conversation is I think you bring a different flavour to our chats because your background psychology, is it? So I want to sort of, as we come to the close of our chat, just to go back to the start, which was about, you made some good observations about the psychological benefits that people get from claiming to be a victim or claiming to stand up for the oppressed. And that was just sort of been percolating in my mind as we've been talking, and I just wanted to come back to that because...
A very important thing too, the genuine victims get neglected.
Yeah, well that's important.
The fake victims have the louder voice.
Yeah, that's right. But so just interested if you're able to elaborate on the psychological, given you've got expertise in that field, just in terms of the benefit, the psychological benefits people get from either claiming to be a victim or claiming to be a champion of victims. If you can elaborate on that.
Yeah. Well, in Australia there's a lot of goodwill for anyone and everyone. And, if you're not too careful, you can be conned into giving your goodwill to a fake victim. And, we see this with charities and that sort of thing. We just assume, well, it must be a legitimate charity, and the people there claiming to care for really must have needs. It happens from time to time. We get conned. But the whole idea of, the benefits of being a victim or playing the victim role, let's say playing the victim role, is that you're, not so much monetary rewards. The higher rewards, more convenient rewards, are the power that comes with being able to silence a person, being able to shoot you down. Well, you've never walked a mile in my shoes, so therefore your arguments are invalid. That's very powerful. You do get that immediate adrenaline rush. So that's very motivating. And unfortunately, we live in a society where often the recipient of that attack, a silencing, will reciprocate and play their part. Oh, okay, sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. And you've just rewarded that person. Okay. And, behaviour rewarded is behaviour reinforced. So the person thinks, oh, this is, not consciously thinks this, but just thinks, oh, that's good. All I have to say is 200 years of oppression, and suddenly people shut up. The power you get with that. And now for those who are advocates for those playing, either genuine victims or those playing the role of victim, it can be very hard to know, for the average Aussie out there, look, I want to do something, but how do I help them? What can I do to make a difference? Just simply making these claims of, racism, it's terrible. I feel so much better now. I've made my contribution. And very often you haven't. You've just fed the fire, the wrong sort of fire. So, people are just wanting those shortcuts to feeling good. And as I said a minute ago, the true victims often get left behind. You can often get yourself a position, paid or unpaid, where you're, seen as the expert on a topic such as Indigenous affairs. And, that, again, a bit of a power rush there. But, the adrenaline from being the victim and the hero kind of goes hand in hand. I'm a victim, but I've also risen above it. I'm a hero as well. Very powerful.
Yes.
Now, coming back to emotional blackmail where, someone says, oh, I'm oppressed, and people around them go, oh, I'm sorry, as a white person, I don't understand these things, whatever. I'm kind of, I can use my black privilege to a degree. And not just with Indigenous affairs too, but with other, victimhood isn't just restricted to Indigenous people. We live in a society where if you play the victim, say you're offended, there's usually going to be someone like a lawyer who's listening.
Yeah.
Who will help you out.
Yeah.
So anyway, in the circles I move in, if someone, tells me they're offended with what I said or whatever, I'll just say, you can make yourself as upset and as offended as you want. That's my point of view at this stage. I might change it later on, but this is what I truly believe. Go take your friend's game somewhere else.
Yep.
So they quickly learn, don't play that game with me.
Yep.
Again, in some settings where it's just not worth it,
Yeah.
I let it go.
No, very good, Anthony. I think that might be a good note to end on.
Well, there's something else to add, and that is the angle of self-determination.
Yes.
Can we talk about that?
Please talk about that. Tell me about that.
The term self-determination, most of us have heard of it. Even if we don't quite know what it means, we know it's something good. It's been presented as something good. Now, to me, self-determination, and of course the relevance of this is going to be seen, the voice will be seen as an expression of self-determination.
Yep.
Now, oh yes, we have Indigenous people acting on behalf or speaking for Indigenous people. And this is, other campaign slogan, nothing about us without us.
Yeah.
So self-determination can be defined in one or two ways. I think the true or the helpful definition, because there could be another definition out there. Often these terms have incompatible definitions. So for me, the true effective definition for self-determination is when I personally decide to make a difference in my life. So, I might decide, not healthy at the moment, but I've got a cold, I've got a cough, okay, I better go see a doctor.
Yep.
Okay, so I don't care whether the doctor's Chinese, male, female, old, young, are they competent?
Yes.
And occasionally there's some things you may prefer to talk to a male doctor or someone your age, but generally speaking, are they competent? Okay, so I've made the decision to get help. Okay, or someone may have suggested to me, Anthony, you really should go see a doctor, or you really need to work on your weight, that sort of thing. Okay, thanks for that advice. Who would I see? And they'd say, oh, well, come to my gym. Okay, great.
Yeah.
But essentially, I'm sort of putting one foot in front of the other.
Yes.
So it's an individual thing. That's true self-determination. It doesn't mean being independent. It means being proactive and doing something to improve your situation. The fake self-determination, which is kind of characterised, well, not kind of has characterised Aboriginal affairs for so long, and this was one of the first things that got me going, 25, nearly 30 years ago, is that self-determination has been misrepresented as Indigenous people doing things for Indigenous people.
Yeah.
So therefore, you've got a group of Indigenous people, let's say they need their car fixed or their bodies fixed or whatever. Oh, we'll go to that Indigenous service. That's self-determination. No, look, there's nothing wrong with that, provided it's a quality service.
Yes.
Okay. And there are good quality Indigenous services out there, among some other ones which we won't talk about.
Yeah.
But so long as the individual has choice, that if they want to go to the Aboriginal specific service, they can, but if they just want to go to the non-specific service, they can as well.
Yes.
But people should have choice and autonomy there. So just summing, self-determination is not members of one group being assisted by members of another group.
Yes.
That's not self-determination.
Yeah.
Self-determination is something individuals do. And I have this concern that the voice will be sold as, at last, this is true self-determination for Indigenous people, which is essentially, when self-determination is defined that way, it's essentially separatism.
Yeah.
If you're Indigenous, you go through that door. If you're not Indigenous, you go through that door. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. And just to round that out is...
So I just want to say, a lot of great Indigenous services. I'm not saying get rid of them. but people can and should have choice. And, sometimes that service is very important, particularly in a remote area, where language may be a problem, understanding, the locals don't speak the language, or there's a specific problem in that area.
And just to round that out, is one of your concerns about the voice that it will then perhaps be a path to further internal division in our country?
Yeah. And look, and as we mentioned earlier, I'm concerned about what the voice will do. If it gets up, what are the things it'll start doing? What are the things that it will prevent from happening? And maybe Indigenous people think, we've got the voice now, all is okay, I'm going to be fixed, I don't have to do anything.
Yeah, just like the apology and so forth.
Yeah, exactly, that could happen. And then the other third thing is, once we have it, what will it then evolve into? Will its reach expand? We say it's going to be this, but could it, are we then looking at reparations?
Yeah.
Are we then looking at having a minute's silence? Are we then looking at, every street should have at least one Indigenous person? Nonsense like that. That's a bit exaggerated, but will that happen?
Yeah, well, a treaty is another example that was foreshadowed as been talked about for a while, but it's now been foreshadowed as something that will come after the voice. And
it's in that Uluru Statement, and I've always said, again, if we come back to the architects of the voice, they're all doing pretty well. But they've done it without the voice. They've done it without the treaty.
Yeah.
They've done it without all these things, and I take my hat off to those Indigenous, those architects of the Indigenous voice. It's no secret I disagree with them on a lot of things, but I give them respect for the fact that they've been able to make a good life for themselves. And they've done it without a treaty. They've done it without a voice.
Yeah.
And you hear this argument often, apparently Australia is the only Commonwealth country that doesn't have a treaty with its Indigenous people. So that alone isn't reason for treaty. Tell me how a treaty will help Indigenous people. And like the voice, tell me what it will allow to happen that we can't already do now. And as far as, this might be a good thing to finish on. I think I said this at CPAC the other day. I like to think for any Indigenous person or non-Indigenous, no matter how bad your circumstances are, no matter where you are, there are always many good Aussies willing to give you a helping hand and help you out of that situation. It won't happen like that, but there are pathways out of bad circumstances, and that's what Aussies are good at. They're good at helping others, unless identity politics gets in the way, and that's sort of like the arterial plaque that causes the heart attack. But generally speaking, there's so much goodwill, they will help anyone and everyone.
That's a fantastic note to end on. So, Anthony, thank you again for the time. Really appreciate you coming to our office and coming to our Ballyou My studio here in Melbourne. So thank you for taking the time, and thank you for everything that you do.
Look, thank you very much for having me here. It's an important topic, and it's only going to heat up.
Yes.
They're talking about a referendum date in the financial year.
Yeah, sometime in the next financial year. So it's not far off, unfortunately, but I'm sure we'll be having many more chats.
Okay, yes. Always available. Thank you.